Hi, everyone. As we're getting close to our start time, I just wanted to introduce myself. This is Beth Holmes with IT, and I'll throw my email in the chat, but you can send me a chat or an email if you're having any audio problems or connectivity problems, and we will keep everyone muted just to help our connection with Kelly and so that we can hear her better. And then with that said, I'll just pass it to Yvonne for introductions.
Good afternoon again, everyone. This is Yvonne Huntley. I'm the Communications Associate with the North Carolina Partnership for Children. Welcome to each and every one of you for joining us for the virtual Smart Start Conference. We weren't able to be with you in Greensboro this year, so we're happy and grateful for the opportunity to be able to give this information to you virtually. So for today, we have with us Ms. Kelly Bryant. We're coming to you in reference to Raising Mindful Eaters, Supporting Intuitive Eating for Children 0 to 5. Welcome. I present to you Kelly Bryant.
All right, so I am unmuted now and ready to go. So I'm very grateful to the Smart Start Conference for accepting this workshop and for allowing us to do this on a virtual platform since we aren't able to be together in person. I will say I do want this to be interactive, so throughout the presentation, there'll be some different points where I'm going to ask you guys to type in the chat box so we can have a bit of a group discussion. And also if you have questions as you go along, type those in, and Yvonne is going to help me to see those questions so that when we come to transition points, if there's a time where people have questions, hopefully we can take a moment and answer those, and also leave some time at the end for Q&A. So we want to make sure that you guys get the most out of this session. So Yvonne already introduced me, so I'm not going to go into a full depth of my bio, but I did want to throw this slide up just to show that just like all of you, I come at this from different perspectives. So I come from my professional hat when I'm working with families, and then also personally, we're all kind of on this nutrition journey of figuring out what foods work best for our bodies and how we can fuel our bodies to do our work. And also I'm a mom, so all of this is personal as well because I'm kind of trying out things and we're all on a journey, so it's not going to be perfect, but we can kind of work together to get better at this stuff. So today's agenda, what we're going to be talking about, one, I just want to set the stage by going ahead and kind of unpacking why nutrition is so important in early childhood development, and we'll define what we mean by this intuitive eating thing. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how in the process of growing up we can sometimes lose our ability to eat intuitively, and go over some strategies that can support intuitive eating so we don't have to lose that. And in the end, we're going to go over some special considerations. Specifically, I want to talk about affordability and cost, because I know that's always a question when we start talking about healthy eating, because sometimes those fresh foods and those organic foods can cost more, right? Also, we'll talk about some considerations with sensory processing disorder, or if you are working with kids that are on the autism spectrum. And lastly, what might be the greatest challenge is kind of resetting the diet. So if you have a 4-year-old that's already used to eating a lot of processed foods, or every time they see those golden arches, they're like, I want a Happy Meal. How do we reset some of those habits and kind of get back to a healthy place? So if you have those questions that come up throughout the presentation, we will be getting to some of those special considerations at the end. Okay, so first, why are we talking about nutrition in early childhood? I get why we talk about early literacy, early math. Is early nutrition a thing too? So this quote just talks about how food is our common ground. It's a universal experience. We all eat, and we all start to learn from a young age what we're supposed to eat. And we learn that in the context often of our families and our communities, because we're learning what we should be eating, what we shouldn't be putting in our mouths, and kind of how meal times work within our families. So that is something that we should talk about in early childhood, because that's something that every family experiences, and that every family has to kind of find their own way for that. I think I would be remiss not to say that, of course, COVID-19, the coronavirus, has changed some of the landscape of nutrition and may have changed some of the ways that we make recommendations and the resources that we send to families. So this is our first answer in the chat question. So when you've gone to the grocery store, what items have been out of stock? I'm curious to see if your experience has been the same in the areas where you are as I have found in Charlotte. So just type in the chat, fresh meats, eggs, tissues, rice, produce, the canned goods, yeah. Flour, eggs, yeah. Organic oils. So we're getting a consensus on the meat and eggs, the fresh meat especially, and a lot of the non-perishables as well. So the ramen, the canned goods, bread, dairy products. So lots of things are out. So keep your answers coming, but it's sounding like we're having some similar experiences. So in addition to the paper products, like of course the toilet paper, all the memes are going around about the toilet paper being out, but also a lot of the staple products that we would normally shop for have been out as well. So I read a statistic that was saying that Campbell's chicken noodle soup, or the Campbell's company in general, their sales were up 59%. So one thing that I've noticed with families that we work with, or just kind of in general in the community, is when you have something like this, a lot of times people will go out and stock up on these non-perishable products. And it's kind of a safety net, right? Because we don't know what's coming next. People didn't know if the next step was going to be that grocery stores might be shut down, or they may not be able to access this food. So of course they're going to buy food to try to feel safe and have that security. But we can advise people to still choose healthy options when they're buying the non-perishable products. So maybe not going for the more processed options. You can still have fruits and vegetables in a canned form or in a frozen form that you can eat during this time. So you're still getting the nutrition that your body needs. And also we can kind of coach families on how to read those labels and not get the things that have lots of sodium or have sugar added and things like that. Another way that we can coach families is just to be open to trying new things. So a lot of you were talking about the eggs or the different types of meat being out. I know when I went to the store, it's like the whole chicken section, like there was no chicken to be found. So families may have better luck if they kind of try some different things. So maybe trying some meat that they haven't had before. So maybe they're out of chicken, but they have ground lamb or they have some pork. So thinking about different ways they could prepare things to still be able to have the proteins that they need and different food groups that they need, but maybe trying some different recipes out. And another thing we can talk about is just supporting local farms and businesses. So if you guys are anything like the area that I'm around, like every time if I'm to drive by the local Walmart, the parking lot is full. So I don't think they're hurting, but a lot of local businesses maybe. So if there's ways for you to promote local businesses, local farms, definitely do that. So moving forward, so let's kind of dive a little deeper into nutrition in early childhood. So thinking about what is food, kind of what is that definition to us? Food has been defined in a lot of different ways. So a lot of your more nutrition focused sources might talk about how food is fuel. And while that is true, we get our energy from food to be able to play and work and do the things that we need to do. Our bodies aren't simple machines. So we can't look at food just in the context of it fueling our body, because it has so much more of a emotional and communal aspect to it as well. So food is also a way of expressing our identity. So if I were to say I'm vegan, then that would tell you a little bit about in some ways the way I identify. I might go certain places or buy or not buy certain products because of the way I identify with food. If I identify as a foodie or a person who's really adventurous, then you can expect that I'll be always trying the next thing and kind of looking for the new and exciting thing. So the way that we identify a lot of times is expressed in the type of food that we like and the type of food that we regularly eat. And food also, like I said, has that community aspect. So a lot of times the food that we like may tie back into the region that we're from, or maybe our race or ethnicity or our country of origin can have some impact into what type of food we like. And also food brings people together. Food brings family and friends together. A big way that people express their love and care for each other is by preparing food for one another. And also we have to think about food as medicine. You hear now food as medicine, exercise as medicine, thinking about how our lifestyle choices kind of impact the ways that we age and just kind of our quality of life across the lifespan. So let this quote here sink in. The food you eat can be either the safest and most powerful form of medicine or the slowest form of poison. So we know that a lot of preventable disease ties into our food. A lot of the ways that our genes express or don't express themselves has to do with our diet. So it is really important, even from the early childhood education level, to start talking about this and get families thinking about this, because we know in this field that an ounce of prevention goes a long way, so that hopefully these kids can kind of start at a good place with a healthy diet. And this next generation coming up, when they get to be 50, 60 years old, hopefully we can see a reduction in diabetes, hypertension, and things like that that we know are impacted by our diet. So now this is where we have our polling question. So food means a lot of different things. So think back to when you were a child, and the poll's gonna come up. Think back about what messages you learned or heard about food and eating. So you can go ahead and select and hit submit. And if you've chosen other messages, feel free to type in the chat box what other messages resonated with you all from your childhood. And as I'm giving you guys some time to answer that poll question and to come up with our results, let me talk through some of those things. So in the poll, you're seeing things like don't play with your food, no desserts unless you eat your veggies, clean your plate. If you're good, go get ice cream. And then some messages that kind of deal with your appearance. So if you appear to be a skinnier or underweight kid, you might have people telling you to like eat up, eat some more, have some of this. And then the opposite can sometimes be true if you appear to be an overweight child, whether or not that ties into your actual health markers. Sometimes people can have some things to say about what you should and shouldn't be eating. And then I see some people have typed in the chat, food is for special occasions and for treats. There are other children who don't have what you have. So again, that kind of goes to cleaning that plate. Don't count the food. Okay. So a lot of different messages that we're learning as we go through. And the thing that I want you to take away from this is just that we say different things, and probably all of us have heard variations of this. And just for us as adults to be mindful that sometimes children interpret those messages differently. And sometimes kids can take things very literally. And that's kind of the way that their brains work. So through that, we can kind of unintentionally pass on messages about food that we didn't mean for kids to get, but that they take in a different way. So for example, if we're saying clean your plate, in some ways, or for some children, that might teach them, okay, I'm not done until this plate is empty or until this container is empty, versus listening to their body's natural hunger and fullness cues. So that kind of ties into more the intuitive eating that we'll talk about. Or if we say no dessert unless we eat our veggies, we have to be careful to set up that eating vegetables is a positive thing too. So we don't want to have kids thinking, okay, we got to plow through these nasty veggies to get to this good dessert. We want them to think of eating vegetables as a good experience as well. So not that these things are bad, but just for us as practitioners and as caregivers to be mindful of, okay, this is what I said. What message am I sending? Sometimes indirectly through what I said. So going on with that.
And Kelly, there is one, you clean the plate because people are hungry around the world and you're wasting.
Yes, and we'll kind of address that a little bit. We're going to talk a little about portions and things like that, and ways that parents can keep from wasting food or feeling like they've wasted food. So thinking about intuitive eating, let's kind of define that now so that we're all on the same page and we know what we're talking about here when we use those terms. So when we say that something is intuitive, that means that it's instinctive. So it's something that we don't have to be taught. So if you've heard people talk about like some app or program and they're like, yeah, the software is pretty intuitive. What they're meaning is you should be able to download this app, open it up, and figure out how to use it without an instruction manual or without someone having to teach you. So it's the same thing when we talk about intuitive eating. So this quote is from Eating Disorders, nationaleatingdisorders.org. Intuitive eating is about trusting your inner body wisdom to make choices around food that feel good in your body without judgment and without influence from the diet culture. We are all born with the skill to eat, to stop when we are full, to eat when we are hungry, and to eat satisfying foods. So that's how they define it. We're going to talk a little bit further in the presentation about what this diet culture concept is. But essentially all we're saying is that when kids are born, they know how to do these things. So let's think about that across the first couple years of life. So when we have the newborn baby, the breastfeeding moms learn to read the infant's hunger and fullness cues. They're noticing that as they feed their baby, the caregivers are noticing that their baby is growing. Their baby is eating more and more each month. In the first year of life, the baby is tripling their birth weight from when they were born in the hospital until that first year. And then parents get this toddler from the around years 1 and 2, and they're still growing, but not at nearly the same rate. So you're not tripling your body weight from the time you're age 1 till the time you're age 2. And so it can seem like the toddlers are snacking, like maybe they're not eating enough, because parents are kind of used to that flow of like, okay, it's this month, the baby should be eating more, should be eating more, should be eating more. And actually after we hit that age of 1 up through preschool, the recommendation is about a tablespoon of a certain food per age. So when we're kind of filling these big plates for kids, it's not really even developmentally appropriate for them to eat that much food sometimes. And they know that intuitively because their body is telling them like, okay, I don't need as much. I want to run around and play. Like I'm not so interested in eating at this certain time. But we as adults kind of get caught more in, okay, this is the time to eat. This is a meal time. Or sometimes we're influenced by the things we read or different fad diets and things like that that might say things as opposed to listening to our body and kind of tuning in to those hunger cues. Okay, so type in the chat, what are some of the first ways that we see children becoming independent? So when we transition from those babies to toddlers, how do we know? What are some signs of independence that we see? Type those in the chat for me. Self-feeding, finger foods, wanting to feed themselves, yeah. Not as messy, being able to pick up their own foods, can do things on their own, saying no to foods, yeah. Wanting to use the utensils, pick out their own meals, liking to have those choices. Grabbing for others' food, yeah, so once they start getting interested in what's in your plate. Good, being able to pick up and handle their food. Going to the feeding area when they're hungry. Yeah, so they're still sending you those hunger cues that they're sending as babies because they might just walk to the table or walk in the kitchen when they're hungry. Good responses. So eating is a form of independence. So when we think about it really as caregivers or providers, the only thing that we're responsible for is as far as what food options we're actually putting out for the child. And how we're presenting it. And that child is responsible for what foods on the plate they actually eat and how much of the foods that they're eating. So it's kind of like sleeping with babies, right? Like we can set the environment to make sleep seem very appealing and inviting. We can turn down the lights and turn on our white noise machine and read a nice storybook, but we're not actually closing the baby's eyes and putting them to sleep. We're setting the environment. And so we're doing the same thing with food. The child is kind of independently deciding like how much to eat and whether or not they're hungry. And we as caregivers are controlling what type of food options are available, and presenting them in a way that makes healthy foods look attractive and appealing. So in that way, kids are already showing some independence and some intuitive eating skills there. So if kids are born able to know when they're hungry and when they're not, and what kind of foods their body is asking for at that moment, how can we lose that? So some of the different ways that we lose our ability to self-regulate are listed here. So I'll highlight a few of these. So one, using food to bribe, comfort, threaten, or reward children's behavior. So when we use food kind of outside of the context of what food is for, and instead use it as a way to modify behavior, then that kind of impinges on the child's ability to eat intuitively, because they can start to learn that, okay, I have to perform to get this food or to get this treat, or they can learn, different messages around the behavior, rather than having those kind of separated. Like, my behavior is this is kind of what my parents' expectations are, separate from the amount or type of food that I'm offered. We talked a little about the portion sizes. Another thing is those highly processed, empty calorie foods. So it's very possible for children to be full, for their stomachs to be full, but for them not to be nourished. So we don't want our kids to be full of those empty calorie foods, but not nourished with those foods that their bodies actually need to grow and be healthy. Another big one is eating while distracted or on the go. And what the research tells us is that when we're eating while we're distracted, so if you're eating but there's a screen on, or there's an iPad, or maybe you're eating in the car on the way from place to place, which we all sometimes have to do in this modern world, then that actually causes people to eat faster, to eat more food without realizing it, but actually to feel less full, so that throughout the day you're eating more food, because your body is not naturally responding to those hunger cues. You're overriding them because the food is kind of, the way you're eating the food, your body's not able to rest and digest. So when we're eating, when we're distracted, or we're eating, we're on the go, that feeds into stress. So if you think about the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, we want our body to be in the rest and digest stage when we're eating our food, not in that fight or flight that we get into when we're eating while we're reading emails, or while we're watching cartoons, or while we're driving in the car from place to place. So we want to practice some of those mindful eating processes we'll talk about a little later. So this slide is just a good visual representation to introduce this concept of diet culture. So if you remember back on the slide when we defined intuitive eating, nationaleatingdisorders.org was talking about this diet culture. So this concept is meaning that kind of, if you look at the picture, it looks like there's maybe a mom and child riding kind of down this river on a piece of cantaloupe, and there's different types of food around them. So what this is depicting, or what I wanted to depict, is that, yeah, parents are the first teachers, and we get a lot from our families about eating, but we also have this kind of pervasive culture that influences what children learn about diets and eating. And even the word diet, that word diet can be used to describe just kind of a way of eating. There are things that you eat, but that when you say the word diet, usually the first thing that pops into people's head is weight loss or restriction and things like that. And that's because we live in a culture that overall promotes shape, size, appearance over health and wellness. And so a lot of the messages that we get, whether it's through commercials or whether it's even through caregivers being influenced by that pervasive culture, that can be passed on to our children. So if our children hear like, oh, I don't want to eat any carbs, or I can't eat this bread because I'm not going to fit into this. Then even at a young age, these messages can get passed on to our kids. And it's not something that we do intentionally. Again, it's just kind of, we're in this culture, we're in this society. It's hard to escape the influence of that totally. But we do have some strategies, luckily, to get through some of these things that can hijack that intuitive eating. So we start off from birth. We know what we want. We eat when we're hungry. We don't eat when we're not. And then, kind of along the way, there are these things that can mess with those cues. But there are also strategies that can support intuitive eating. So the biggest thing that I wanted to go over here is creating your eating culture. So the way to combat drifting through life kind of as part of this diet culture and kind of doing whatever the pervasive culture suggests is to create a different eating culture within your home and within your family. So one way you can do this is to eat screen-free family meals as often as you can. Again, that kind of gives you that space to be able to rest and digest, to have conversations, to enjoy and savor your food. Another thing is to pay attention to the behavior that you want. So one of the parenting programs that I work with now is Triple P, if you guys are familiar with that. So one of the concepts with Triple P is to pay attention to the behavior you want, because that's what you'll get more of. So often we as parents can fall into that trap of ignoring kids when they're being good and then commenting on their behavior when they're doing the behaviors that we don't prefer. But what that teaches kids, again, with this indirect messaging is, okay, when I throw my food or when I mash these peas into the carpet, that's when I get mom or dad's attention, or that's when I get my caregiver's attention, as opposed to really praising that child maybe when they try a new food, or they do something, eat something they've never eaten before, they've eaten with their fork for the first time. So we want to praise that behavior that we want the child to continue. Another one that I want to highlight here is teaching kids which foods have the most nutritional value. And that's as opposed to teaching this food is good and this food is bad. So talking to children about like what specifically those healthy foods are doing for their body. So whether that's talking about different vitamins and minerals and what they do in a very simplistic way on the child's level, or maybe you're talking about protein. Maybe your child prefers the fruit, doesn't really like to eat the meat, and you tell them like, hey, did you know that your body doesn't make protein? You have to eat the protein to get it in your body. And you know what that does? That helps you grow your muscles. And all kids want to have muscles, of course, so they're going to love that idea. So these are just some suggestions that you can coach families on to create that eating culture within their home, and not just kind of go with like the status quo, like making that a priority and thinking about the ways to do that. So thinking about that one, I wanted to put a separate slide completely dedicated just to being an architect of your environment, because this concept, even though it goes along with that creating the eating culture, it's just so important and makes such a difference. So those of you that are kind of in an early childhood classroom probably recognize this picture over here to my left. So in the classroom, we know that we need to create an environment that makes learning seem interesting and attractive and fun for kids. We can do the same thing in our homes and in our kitchens that we're doing in that classroom. So I'd love for you guys to just type in the chat, what are some things you see in this picture of the kitchen that makes eating healthy look attractive and available? So the different colors, yeah. Clear containers so that you can see what's in the food, yeah. Bright fruits and veggies that are available on the countertop. They can be seen, they're not hidden away in the refrigerator. Things you can grab and go, yeah, it's easy to get to. Yeah, the color, the space, having the area clean so you can see what's available. Easy for kids to reach and grab. Yeah, and these are the same exact concepts that we talk about in the classroom. This is why we talk about keeping books on kids' level. So if they want to read, they can go and grab a book, so they can reach the toys and the manipulatives and things like that that we want. We want to make things available and easy for them. And that's because visibility and convenience really matters, and it really changes our behavior. So when we look into some of the research around that, I just wanted to share a few of these studies, not to nerd out on you guys, but I think it's amazing like how much just changing your environment can change your outcome. So there was one study they did with hospitals where all they did was like add a different container that had bottled water as opposed to just soda several places in the room. And they saw an increase in the amount of bottled water people were buying. Now, of course, we want them to use their reusable waters, but I'm glad that they're drinking water, and just having that water there so people saw it made them buy more. In fact, we are 3 times more likely to grab and eat that first thing we see when we open the refrigerator or the pantry than to get the 5th item that we see, is what research says. So when we see the fruits and vegetables or the healthy foods out on the countertops, then that's what we're going to grab. Another study, and this is, I can add this all into our notes if you guys want to have these references, but this is by Wansink et al. What they found is that the folks that they studied, if they had cookies, chips, crackers, cereal, or soda out on the countertop, those participants weighed an average of 22 pounds more than the participants that had fresh fruits and veggies out instead on the countertop. There's also an interesting study about just the visibility of food. We talked about these clear containers. So with candy on the desk, so they had, Cornell University did a study where they had people with a clear bowl of candy on a desk and then a white bowl of candy. So in that clear bowl where they could see the candy, they ate actually 71% more candy than in the white bowl. So this is definitely something that we want to coach our families with. Creating that environment really helps us to stick with those good habits. So just changing how you put things out when you come home from the grocery store, thinking about how we can put out bright, colorful fruits and vegetables, maybe some for older kids, dried fruit, nuts and seeds, nut butters and things like that. All of the healthy foods that kids can kind of grab and go, applesauce, all those kind of things, having that on the child's level and having those things accessible readily for kids. And so sometimes with nutrition, it can get really confusing. Even with me being a nutrition coach, it feels like I can read one thing one day in an article, and then the very next day they're telling me that thing is now bad and maybe we shouldn't be eating as much of it. But I really like, there's one podcast I follow that simplified it down to just a few things. And so that was eating whole foods, not too much, and mostly plants. And as you can see from this slide, it's kind of some of the most popular diets of the day. And the things that they really come together on is that you're limiting the amount of processed foods and instead eating whole foods. So eating things that were at one time alive is a big one. And as well as eating enough food to support your activity, but not too much so that it leads to excess body fat. And then just like the My Plate thing says, filling most of your plate with fruits and vegetables. So even if families can just try to incorporate those 3 things into some goals, that'll get them much closer to a good diet and away from that, what they call like the standard American diet, which is on average 70% processed food instead of eating whole foods. Another thing to remember is that health happens in the middle. So in this kind of continuum we have here, on one end we have eat this or else. So this is the families that kind of ascribe more to the eat what I cook, eat what's on your plate. There are starving families around the world. And then you have the families on the other end of the spectrum, I'm calling here the short order cook. And so those are the families that are like, well, what would you like to eat? Because I want to fix the things that you would like. So type in the chat box. I'd love to hear from you guys. Which type of family did you grow up in, or were you somewhere in the middle? Because I do think that the way that we're raised does kind of impact the way that we provide care, and the way we care for our own children, and probably even some of our ideas kind of going into a classroom setting or an early child care setting. So it sounds like we got a pretty good mix. We got quite a few eat this or else, but some in the middle. Anybody to the right? Yeah. So a few in the middle, quite a few eat this or else. Yeah, and then a budget there. Somebody brought up a tight budget, so that can definitely impact the messages that we send about food. If we don't have a lot of food, then we're saying like, eat this or else, this is what we have, or eat this or else, we don't want to waste it. And somebody being very honest, as a mom, I seem to be more of a short order cook. I feel like that a lot of times too. Good, good. So we have quite an array of different experiences here. And sometimes families can kind of come together and merge these different things into somewhere in the middle. I know my husband, I was kind of sharing some of this with him, and he was talking about how he definitely grew up eat this or else. And he said he did not like squash until I started cooking squash as we were married as adults, because he said as a child he remembers just getting hit in the mouth because he wouldn't eat his squash. And I came from a family that was kind of opposite. So my mom was more like, oh, I'm gonna make the foods that you like. And I shared my opposite story with him, which was I told my mom I didn't like sweet potatoes, and somehow I got myself to throw up because she made me eat the sweet potatoes. It was some kind of weird psychosomatic thing, I'm sure. But she never tried to make me eat sweet potatoes again. So a lot of times even we'll have different parents coming together, and then just because you were raised one way doesn't mean that's necessarily the way that you're gonna do things in your household with your kids. But as we're coaching parents, I think it's good to kind of figure out where they are on the spectrum, meet them where they are, and then figure out, are there ways that you could take one step more towards the middle? So the idea is that we're trying to get parents to a place where they're not ignoring their child's food preferences, so they're aware of what types of foods generally that their child likes more, but at the same time, they're working actively to broaden their child's palate and to introduce these healthy foods. So they're not kind of sitting back and saying like, okay, I'll make whatever you like, but at the same point in time, trying to make those healthy food options look more attractive, so that kids will be willing to try those. And then lastly, as far as the strategies go, thinking about this quote, when walking, walk, when eating, eat. So it's a pretty simple Zen proverb, but it's one of those things that's simple when you think about it, but maybe hard to put into practice. So we talked about earlier some of this distracted eating that we often do when we're eating in the car, we're eating in front of a screen, or we're all kind of sitting down in the living room. We're not, at a table having conversation during the meals. Or sometimes just eating at different times. So you might have the adults eating at one time, kids eating at another time. And so what I would encourage here is coaching families to make that space. And maybe it's not every meal, but to have a certain time when you can sit down and savor a meal together. And what savoring the meal does is it increases gratitude for the kids and the parents, and just generally boosts mood. So boosts the happiness, to be able to sit down, have a meal, savor that experience, and not have so many distractions going on. And for young children, you can bring that mindfulness part in by talking to them about, okay, like, let's talk about some of the different colors on the plate. Or let's talk about the taste. Does this taste sweet to you? Is it salty? You can practice different things as far as like the counting, like how many strawberries do you want on your plate? You want 3? And you're kind of counting and putting things out. So just talking about this experience of the touch and the taste and the smell of the food. One of the messages we talked about earlier in the poll was don't play with your food. So we might not want to encourage playing with our food in the sense of like throwing it across the room, but maybe it's okay to sit down and have an experience where you're able to savor food and you're able to think about the texture and feel the food and use all of your different senses in a meal. So that's another way to kind of sit down, and even if you're not taking it that far, if you can just be at a table for one meal. Maybe it starts as one meal a week. Maybe it starts as one meal out of the day. Maybe it's just like a bedtime snack that you all sit down for. Any of that can help, and can help children to kind of keep this intuitive eating, because they're having that meal time or that snack time where they're able to kind of sit and they can feel when their body is full and hungry, as opposed to when we're going, and we don't even notice those cues. And so this is kind of thinking more about us as adults. I wanted you guys to have this resource. It's just a mindless eating checklist. And so this kind of goes back to that quote of thinking about how, and people will say that practice what you preach, but sometimes what we preach is not what we practice. So as adults and as caregivers and as providers, if we're promoting this with families, it's important for us to also kind of take a look at our own habits around eating. And I think if we're honest, we would have to say that we all sometimes or often do a lot of things on this list just because of the pace of life. So hopefully during this time when a lot of us are working from home or maybe have some modified hours, you've been able to form some good mindful eating habits, but just things like this. So thinking about, am I often eating until I'm too full and not kind of responding to those cues, or eating while I'm standing up or while I'm walking as opposed to sitting down and eating at a table? Am I eating food just because it's there or just because the clock says it's time to eat? Am I eating because I'm hungry, or is it more of an emotional hunger where I'm really bored or lonely or I'm frustrated, and is there something else my body is craving, but I'm filling that with food instead of what my body is maybe really, how my body's really wanting to be nourished. So just thinking about these things and getting more in tune with your own body. And I think the more we can get in tune with our own selves and our hunger cues and all of these different things, the easier we'll be able to model that for our children. And so now we're getting into some of these special considerations as promised. So the first thing I said we're going to talk through here is kind of making these things cost effective. So whatever recommendations, when we're coaching parents through this topic, we want to make sure that they are cost effective as well as culturally competent. So one way to do that is just to ask before we make any recommendations of what the family normally eats. So if you have a family that's like, well, like honestly, we go to Burger King several times a week, then I wouldn't necessarily tell them like, okay, well, what you need to do is go to Whole Foods and buy all organic, grass-fed, wild-caught, this and that, like throwing out all these different things. Maybe I just say like, well, have you ever thought about cooking burgers at home? Let's talk about like how, like what that might look like. So finding ways that you're moving them towards health, but you're just moving them kind of, just moving the needle in a way that they're comfortable making those changes. Because generally when you try to do a whole overhaul with whether it's dealing with the parents or with the kids, an overhaul of everything they're eating, you're going to get more resistance and pushback than if you find out what they normally like and you can help them to see like, oh, okay, like I can make this at home, or I can make this thing that tastes good, and healthy food doesn't have to be bland or doesn't have to be a salad at every meal. Also, we can empower families to make recipes their own. So one thing I've noticed when we do cooking classes and things like that with the families we work with at my job is they'll feel like they have to follow the recipe to a T, as opposed to really understanding that they can make that recipe their own. So it's like, well, if you don't like blueberries, what else could you substitute in there that you do like? Or maybe if they come from a different culture where there's certain seasonings that they like to use in their food, but this calls for something different. Thinking about like, oh, well, maybe we could just kind of throw in that garam masala that you like to use, or throw in some cumin, or something that makes the recipe feel more like their own so that they would enjoy it. We can encourage the use of canned and frozen as well as fresh ingredients. So of course, when things are out of season, it can be more difficult to buy foods from a cost perspective. So, you know, strawberries. There's a season where the strawberries are on sale and a season where the strawberries cost you an arm and a leg. So thinking about how you could buy those, or peaches. You can buy canned, frozen, or fresh, as long as you're buying that in its own 100% juice or in water. You're not adding any extra sugar. You're still getting that nutrient value, but you can get it at a lower cost. And also along with that, sharing cost comparisons of eating at home or eating out versus cooking at home. So thinking about those recipes you can make that you can feed an army for just a couple of bucks. So pot of chili or something like that. You can actually eat for less cooking at home in some ways than eating out, especially if you've got DoorDash and things like that where they're adding on those extra fees for delivery. And lastly, we want to ensure that caregivers have the skills needed to cook at home. So sometimes we can advise certain things, or we're telling people like you need to cook at home more often, but not asking that question to find out whether they feel comfortable. So we can't assume that people know things. You know, some people grow up learning in the kitchen, some people don't. Some people kind of come into adulthood and they're used to going and buying food or getting convenience food or frozen meals. So they really just don't feel comfortable doing that. But there's, you know, millions of YouTube videos you can send them, or different tutorials that can help them feel comfortable with their skills there. And we also need to modify suggestions for children if we do know that there are sensory processing issues, or if you have children you're working with that are on the autism spectrum. I know I shared on the slide at the beginning that my son's on the spectrum, and so this is a continual process that we're going through, is just trying to get him to try new foods. So one suggestion here is to start slowly with 1 or 2 new foods. So just like we said, no one likes that overhaul of the diet. Don't put out a plate that has all things that the child's not going to recognize. So maybe there's 2 or 3 things that your child likes, and you've just put that one new food there for them. Often kids with sensory processing, it's more of kind of a texture thing. And it could be anything. It could be like the texture of the food, how it smells, how it looks, all of that. But for some kids, they prefer like that crunchy texture. So when you're preparing vegetables, thinking of ways you can do that to make them crunchier, whether that's like maybe you start with veggie chips and move to kind of roasted vegetables. But if they're not liking that mushy consistency, trying to stay away from steamed vegetables and things like that where the texture is not going to be inviting. Another thing is to get the whole family involved in mealtime. So again, modeling. Make sure that your children are seeing you eating things and saying that you enjoy them. So it's not like that child is singled out, like you try this. And then practice makes perfect. So I know you guys have probably seen some of the research that talks about how it can take 15 plus times of introducing a new food for a child to try it and even to like it. So if it takes that many times just in general, just think if a child has a sensory processing disorder, it could take even longer than that. So just having that knowledge that it might take several attempts. And it's not going to be, you know, something that's always quick and overnight, but just practicing that and celebrating anytime that your child is willing to try something new. And again, I said this might be the most challenging, is like once those habits have already been established, getting kids to try some different things. So once there's kind of already, you know, they've already been introduced to highly processed foods, or they've already been introduced to fast food, it can be hard to kind of convince the kids to like, okay, we're going to try these fruits and vegetables. But there are some ways to help with that. So one, we talked about an environment making healthy foods available and attractive. So having the bright colors, having the foods out, in kind of the equal and opposite to that is to make the food you want to limit less available and less attractive. So we talked about that study where when the cereal and the cookies and crackers were out, people went for that more often. So certainly families that are, you know, wanting to conserve costs aren't going to want to go through necessarily and throw away everything in their pantry that isn't good. But just think about it like the grocery stores do. So at the grocery stores, they put the things on eye level that they want you to buy. So do the same thing in your home. So if you have, you know, a pack of Oreos or something that you want to save for a treat, put those behind the other things. So it's not like every time you open the pantry, boom, there are the Oreos. And so then you can kind of keep those when there are occasions when you want to have a treat, or, you know, you've had some healthy foods and it's within your balanced diet. But the more you can kind of keep those less out of the forefront, it's kind of like when you're weaning a child from a pacifier, right? It's like once they see that pacifier, like you almost have to give it to them because they're gonna like just cry and scream until they get that pacifier because they saw it. But a lot of times if you can keep that passy out of sight and you have them engaged in another attractive activity that keeps their focus and keeps their energy and attention, they're not even thinking about that. So you can kind of do the same thing with food. We're making our food look attractive. We're making healthy foods available. So maybe they won't even think about the Oreos that are back in the back of the cupboard. Another thing we can do is consider ways to add more healthy food instead of restricting. So that's the part about like the weight loss diets that makes them so intolerable, is that you're restricting food, you're keeping yourself from the things that you might want or crave. So instead of doing that, thinking of what are ways we can add more healthy food. Because either way, so if we get our child to eat a banana, they're going to be more full, so they're going to have less room for those Oreos. So maybe they've eaten the banana and now they only eat a couple Oreos, whereas before, that would have been all they ate. So you're still getting some nutritious food in there. So it's still a win. We got to kind of take those baby steps when we can. Another thing is we can involve children in selecting healthy food options. So if kids are with us at the grocery store, having them pick out, I know right now we're trying to limit exposure. So maybe parents are going shopping on their own, but still kind of giving that option like, would you like to have carrots with your meal today? Or would you like to have potatoes? Something like that, where you're giving choices. And also, we can encourage caregivers to focus on the process rather than the product. So what that means is when we have parents that set a goal for healthy eating for their family. So maybe their goal is, I want to offer a fruit or vegetable every day at dinner time. So maybe the family's saying, I know I haven't really been offering these on a consistent basis. This is something I could do. Have that parent focus on their effort to have that fruit or vegetable. So when you're talking with that parent, asking them how things are going, if they say, well, I offered the fruit and vegetable every day, but my child didn't always eat it, that's still a win, because the win is that they stayed consistent in offering that fruit or vegetable. And then whether or not the child eats it, that's kind of up to the child, and we don't have control over that. So what we want to focus on is the areas that we can control, which is the things that we're offering to the child, making sure that they're attractive and available. And if the parent's doing that, then they're doing their part. And lastly, just kind of piggybacking off of that idea of focusing on the process, this last visual is just a melting ice cube. And a lot of times this is the way it is, especially around setting up healthy habits around nutrition and things like that. We do the healthy habits and we don't see the immediate outcome from those. So just like a melting ice cube, if we're raising the temperature in the room to melt the ice, you know, the temperature gets to 50 degrees, you don't see anything happening. It's at 44, still nothing is happening. It gets all the way down to 34, still nothing is happening. So it takes a lot of effort and kind of chipping away at that temperature to get it down where the temperature is what it would need to be. So it's kind of a similar thing when we're suggesting these nutrition things. A lot of times we're having to kind of continually go through the process over and over. And then one day, your child just out of the blue decides to try something. And we celebrate those moments. But it can kind of feel like you're not making headway. But that's just because these things accumulate. And just like bad habits accumulate, it takes good habits a while too also. So the good thing is we're talking about very young children. So hopefully they haven't developed a lot of unhealthy habits. But if we can even impact that family eating culture for those kids while they're in that 0 to 5 age, just think how much easier that would be, even from trying to change the eating habits of a teenager, or certainly us as adults. It can be harder to change our habits once they've been ingrained for so many years. So that kind of covers my suggestions. I know we just have about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to take it to the chatter if there's anyone that wanted to unmute and ask a question aloud. I think we gave you guys a craving for Oreos. My bad, I shouldn't have said that. We might have got the wrong effect. And I do believe that Jessica posted the PDF of my slides in the chat here, and it's also going to be on the website for you guys. And then my information is available to you too on there, I believe. So if you have any questions afterwards, or if you want to shoot me an email, then please feel free to do so.
Wonderful, Kelly. I want to thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I think everyone enjoyed